good afternoon, everybody. My name is Judith Ruderman, and I'm so happy to be with you today to talk to you, to read to you from Isabel Wilkerson's Caste. Wilkerson is an amazing storyteller, although she writes incisive, important, deep social commentary. She's an historian. She does so in a very engaging, approachable way in both her first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, which won the Pulitzer Prize, and in this book called Caste, because she uses many, many specifics in order to bolster and explain her general thesis. So I'm going to read to you a few excerpts from this book. The first one is the general point that she makes, and even there, she uses a wonderful metaphor to bring it alive. And then the other excerpts are going to be from personal experience, her personal experience. So here we go. The inspector trained his infrared lens onto a misshapen bow in the ceiling, an invisible beam of light searching the layers of lath to test what the eye could not see. This house had been built generations ago, and I had noticed the slightest welt in a corner of plaster in a spare bedroom and had chalked it up to idiosyncrasy. Over time, the welt in the ceiling became a wave that widened and bulged despite the new roof. It had been building beyond perception for years. An old house is its own kind of devotional, a dowager aunt with a story to be coaxed out of her, a mystery, a series of interlocking puzzles awaiting solution. Why is this soffit tucked into the southeast corner of an eave? What is behind this discolored patch of brick? With an old house, the work is never done, and you don't expect it to be. America is an old house. We can never declare the work over. Wind, flood, drought, and human upheavals batter a structure that is already fighting whatever flaws were left unattended in the original foundation. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have wrought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester whether you choose to look or not. Ignorance is no protection from the consequences of inaction. Whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you gather the courage to face what you would rather not see. We in the developed world are like homeowners who inherited a house on a piece of land that is beautiful on the outside, but whose soil is unstable loam and rock, heaving and contracting over generations, cracks patched, but the deeper ruptures waved away for decades, centuries even. Many people might rightly say, I had nothing to do with how this all started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people, never owned slaves. And yes, not one of us was here when this house was built. Our immediate ancestors may have had nothing to do with it, but here we are, the current occupants of a property with stressed cracks and bowed walls and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with it. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. And any further deterioration is in fact on our hands. Unaddressed, the ruptures and diagonal cracks will not fix themselves. The toxins will not go away, but rather will spread, leach, and mutate as they already have. When people live in an old house, they come to adjust to the idiosyncrasies and outright danger skulking in an old structure. They put buckets under a wet ceiling, prop up groaning floors, learn to step over that rotting wood tread in the staircase. The awkward becomes acceptable, and the unacceptable becomes merely inconvenient. Live with it long enough, and the unthinkable becomes normal. Exposed over the generations, we learn to believe that the incomprehensible is the way that life is supposed to be. The inspector was facing the mystery of the misshapen ceiling, and so he first held the sensor to the surface to detect if it was damp. The reading inconclusive, he then pulled out the infrared camera to take a kind of X-ray of whatever was going on, the idea being that you cannot fix a problem until and unless you can see it. He could now see past the plaster, beyond what had been wallpapered or painted over, as we now are called upon to do in the house we all live in, to examine a structure built long ago. Like other old houses, America has an unseen skeleton, a caste system that is as central to its operation as are the studs and joists that we cannot see in the physical buildings we call home. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. It is the architecture of human hierarchy, the subconscious code of instructions for maintaining, in our case, a 400-year-old social order. Looking at caste is like holding the country's X-ray up to the light. A caste system is an artificial construction, a fixed and embedded ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits that would be neutral in the abstract but are ascribed life and death meaning in a hierarchy favoring the dominant caste whose forebears designed it. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the rank groupings apart, distinct from one another, and in their assigned places. Throughout human history, 3 caste systems have stood out. The tragically accelerated, chilling, and officially vanquished caste system of Nazi Germany, the lingering millennia-long caste system of India, and the shape-shifting, unspoken race-based caste pyramid in the United States. Each version relied on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest-ranked people at the bottom and to rationalize the protocols of enforcement. A caste system endures because it is often justified as divine will, originating from sacred text or the presumed laws of nature, reinforced throughout the culture and passed down throughout the generations. As we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. The hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality. It is about power. Which groups have it and which do not. It is about resources. Which caste is deemed worthy of them and which are not. Who gets to acquire and control them and who does not. It is about respect, authority, and assumptions of competence. Who is accorded these and who is not. As a means of assigning value to entire swaths of humankind, caste guides each of us often beyond the reaches of our awareness. It embeds into our bones an unconscious ranking of human characteristics and sets forth the rules, expectations, and stereotypes that have been used to justify brutalities against entire groups within our species. In the American caste system, the signal of rank is what we call race, the division of humans on the basis of their appearance. In America, race is the primary tool and the visible decoy, the front man, for caste. Race does the heavy lifting for a caste system that demands a means of human division. If we have been trained to see humans in the language of race, then caste is the underlying grammar that we encode as children, as when learning our mother tongue. Caste, like grammar, becomes an invisible guide, not only to how we speak, but to how we process information, the autonomic calculations that figure into a sentence without our having to think about it. Many of us have never taken a class in grammar, yet we know in our bones that a transitive verb takes an object, that a subject needs a predicate. We know without thinking the difference between third-person singular and third-person plural. We may mention race, referring to people as black or white or Latino or Asian or indigenous, when what lies beneath each label is centuries of history and assigning of assumptions and values to physical features in a structure of human hierarchy. What people look like, or rather the race they have been assigned or are perceived to belong to, is the visible cue to their caste. It is the historic flashcard to the public of how they are to be treated, where they are expected to live, what kinds of positions they're expected to hold, whether they belong in this section of town or that seat in the boardroom, whether they should be expected to speak with authority on this or that subject, whether they will be administered pain relief in a hospital, whether their neighborhood is likely to adjoin a toxic waste site or have contaminated water flowing from their taps, whether they are more or less likely to survive childbirth in the most advanced nation in the world, whether they may be shot by authorities with impunity. We know that the letters of the alphabet are neutral and meaningless until they are combined to make a word, which itself has no significance until it is inserted into a sentence and interpreted by those who speak it. In the same way that black and white were applied to people who were literally neither, but rather gradations of brown and beige and ivory, the caste system sets people at poles from one another and attaches meaning to the extremes and to the gradations in between, and then reinforces those meanings, replicates them in the roles each caste was and is assigned and permitted or required to perform. Caste and race are neither synonymous nor mutually exclusive. They can and do coexist in the same culture and serve to reinforce each other. Race in the United States is the visible agent of the unseen force of caste. Caste is the bones, race is the skin. Race is what we can see, the physical traits that have been given arbitrary meaning and become shorthand for who a person is. Caste is the powerful infrastructure that holds each group in place. Caste is fixed and rigid. Race is fluid and superficial, subject to periodic redefinition to meet the needs of the dominant caste in what is now the United States. While the requirements to qualify as white have changed over the centuries, the fact of a dominant caste has remained constant from its inception. Whoever fit the definition of white at whatever point in history was granted the legal rights and privileges of the dominant caste. Perhaps more critically and tragically, at the other end of the ladder, the subordinated caste too has been fixed from the beginning as the psychological floor beneath which all other castes cannot fall. Thus, we are all born into a silent war game, centuries old, enlisted in teams, not of our own choosing. The side to which we are assigned in the American system of categorizing people is proclaimed by the team uniform that each caste wears, signaling our presumed worth and potential. That any of us manages to create abiding connections across these manufactured divisions is a testament to the beauty of the human spirit. The use of inherited physical characteristics to differentiate inner abilities and group value may be the cleverest way that a culture has ever devised to manage and maintain a caste system. That's the general that I spoke about, the general point of her entire book. But now I'm going to read to you excerpts that deal with Isabel Wilkerson's personal experiences that point up exactly what she was generalizing about. Here we go. My work has required me to spend many, many hours in settings where I am often the only person of my ethnicity and gender, most often on planes. A flight attendant once commented on the miles I log each year in and year out. You fly more than we do. Because I fly so often, I frequently have cause to be seated in first or business class, which can turn me into a living, breathing social experiment without wanting to be. The things that have happened to me are far from the most grievous a person might suffer when traveling in a domain that can bring out the worst in most anyone. But some have stood out as a commentary on caste and action and can be demoralizing in the unexpected moment of intrusion. For a flight out of Denver, I happened to be one of the first aboard the plane, along with others in the front cabin. I could see the lead flight attendant greeting passengers at the boarding door. He was a man in his late 20s or early 30s, short, blondish hair, and behind him was a second flight attendant, her brunette hair in a French twist. The tendinitis in my wrist had been flaring up, and as I stepped onto the plane with a splint on my forearm, I looked over to the lead flight attendant for help with my carry-on. "Sir," I said, "I'm having a problem with my wrist, and I wonder if you would help me get my bag in the bin." He looked past me to the men behind me at the boarding door, the kind of men who would come to mind when you think of first class. He waved me along as if I were holding up the line, though no one was moving at the moment. He seemed insulted even to have been asked, as if I was not aware of how the boarding process worked. "There are 2 flight attendants in the back," he said. "They can help you when you get back there." With those curt instructions, it was as if he had pulled me out of a lineup, singled me out from the other business travelers as the one who on sight did not belong, the one trespassing, and now seeking special treatment to which I was not entitled. Marginalized people have a hard enough time moving about in a world built for others. Now it was as if I was taking up space that belonged to its rightful passengers. It came as a shock to me, perhaps because this clipped dismissal came from a man whose generation would not be expected to hold such retrograde assumptions. Somehow the air had turned confrontational. I had asked for something he did not believe I deserved. "But I'm in first," I said. That seemed only to make things worse. He'd been caught in his moment of stereotyping and in front of others. He had disregarded all information inputs to the contrary, that I was boarding early, that luggage tags dangling from the bag I was seeking help with proclaimed that I had reached the highest possible level of loyalty to his airline. He could only have come to the conclusion he made on the basis of one thing alone, what I looked like. He tried to recover from the faux pas of an openly dismissive caste assumption. For what is caste if not where one belongs in a hierarchy? He had to find a way to retain his own caste position, now that a flight attendant under him in the airline's hierarchy had heard him speak so brusquely to a passenger, wherever she happened to be seated. "We'll leave it here and we'll have to see what to do with it," he said, sighing, as if it were a bass violin instead of a rolling bag. The woman flight attendant who stood there during the exchange stepped forward and tried to set things right. Cover for him, her superior. "Here," she said, "let me help you with it. What seat are you in?" She walked me to the seat and helped me hoist the bag into the bin. I thanked her for her kindness. It was uncomfortable the rest of the flight. He was the only attendant in that cabin, and each time he passed through the aisle, the tension rose. I could feel the edge of it. He had been outed, and he punished me with the curt hostility until we landed. Here's another airplane incident. I had been up since before 5 in the morning for the flight out of Idaho Falls. The original flight was canceled, the second one delayed, and now finally I was on the last leg of the journey, the connecting flight out of Salt Lake City that would not get me in until 10:30 p.m. I was in seat 2D, a window in first, the only passenger in that cabin who was African American. The lead attendant was a black man, small in frame, cheerful and efficient. "What are you having, my friend?" he asked the male passengers as he chatted them up. "And you?" he said, terse and impatient, when he got to me. Upon landing, the mad shuffle began for everyone's respective bag in the overhead compartments. Passengers crowded into the aisle, and I was standing behind a man who looked to be in his 30s, his light hair in a buzz cut. He asked a woman next to him if she needed help with her bag. He pulled it down for her, and she thanked him. Then he began to reach for his own bag. It was in the compartment above and behind me. He did not speak nor gesture in my direction. Instead, he reached back up and over me, wordlessly leaned farther and farther, his body at a backward angle against mine, pinning me under his torso and leaving me no escape because of the wall of passengers packed behind me. I was in disbelief, forced to arch my body back as he rammed himself harder against me, heavy and sweaty, shifting his feet now, shoving his thick arm across my face and against the side of my neck to unloosen the bag from the compartment. He thrust his full weight, his entire frame into mine, his back muscles crushing my breasts, his buttocks protruding into my pelvis, violating my body in full view of the other passengers, and no one was saying or doing a thing. "Hey, I can't go back any further," I told him in a plea for help, loud enough for everyone to hear me. He said nothing, as if I were not there, as if nobody were there, as if the laws of physics or privacy did not apply. I tried to hold my head away from his shoulder blade so that I could breathe. It was taking the ground crew forever to open the boarding door. I looked around for whoever would recognize the horror of a complete stranger forcing himself onto you. I looked over to the two young women who were inches away and who could see what he was doing. I gave them a look of distress and shock at the man's aggression. I was needing empathy. They were standing so close they could share a sense of womanly outrage at what was happening, but their faces were blank. They looked into space, returned no glance. A silence of complicity had overtaken the entire first-class cabin, and I was alone in a packed compartment. Not one of these passengers would have lost their job or a promotion, lost money or privilege, had they stood up that day. Very likely they would never see these other passengers again in their lives, and stepping up would have had no material consequences. But that day, with so very little at stake to themselves, they chose caste solidarity over principle, tribe over empathy. The boarding door finally opened. The passengers filed out, and the man finally eased his behind off of me. The black flight attendant, who had seen all of it, had not come to my aid nor spoken up, though he was the flight attendant in charge. As I approached the door, he looked up at me, sheepish and shamefaced. "I'm really sorry," he said. "Thanks, I know," I said, shaking my head. He hadn't intervened. He too seemed powerless. He couldn't likely have taken the risk. This was an upper caste man assaulting a lower caste woman, and the lead attendant was lower caste himself. The lead attendant very likely had no idea what the man's position might be, what power and influence he might have had. Why should he stick his neck out for me and get on the bad side of heaven knows who? The man had bullied me out in the open with witnesses all around who pretended not to see. The lead attendant likely felt it would do him no good to get involved. In a caste system, things work more smoothly when everyone stays in their place, and that is what he did. I was shaking and livid. Once off the plane and out in the terminal, the man who had forced me into a vertical spoon with him in front of an audience was walking with a brisk swagger several paces ahead of me. He knew full well what he had done. Cocking his head back at me, he spat out a curt, "Sorry," and kept walking with the entitlement that comes from knowing he could get away with it. There would be no consequences. Not one person had stepped to my defense or shown a blink of compassion. A host of factors might have made things different. Perhaps it was the lateness of the hour that inured some people. Perhaps it was just the singular combination of personalities that left me without anyone to stand up to it. Change one or two seats with different people, and there might have been a different outcome. One thing seems certain. Had an African-American man pressed his body against a white woman the way this man had, it is hard to imagine that no one on board would have intervened, if only to say to him, "I'll get your bag for you so you can get off of her." Over the course of American history, Black men have died for doing far less to white women than what he did to me that night. You might say, why didn't you complain to the airline? Why didn't you tell him off? Those questions belie the situation. This was not the fault of the airline. As for the man who did this, he ignored my protests of his behavior. This happened because good people were silent and let it happen. I was too disgusted to reply as the man swaggered ahead of me. I made my way to the other side of the passenger walkway and continued until he was out of my sight. One more episode, also from her own experience. We had sat down for dinner, a family friend and I, at a chic restaurant in a hip section of a major American city. I did not know her well, but I knew that she was an artsy, free spirit, kind-hearted, and well-traveled. She was also from the dominant caste and had grown up in a neighborhood surrounded mainly by people like herself. As we sat catching up on each other's lives that each of us had known only from afar, several waiters passed by, and it was unclear which one was ours. Finally, a waiter stopped at our table. He was blonde, curt, and matter-of-fact. I ordered fish, she ordered pasta. We both ordered drinks, an appetizer or two. While we waited for the drinks to arrive, a couple from the dominant caste, same caste as her, sat down at the table next to us. Our waiter rushed over to take their order, now charming and effusive, filling them in on the specials, chatting them up. Seconds later, he brought a basket of bread to their table. He brought them their drinks shortly thereafter, while we sipped water and waited for ours. The family friend was growing impatient, seething, actually, and turned to see where he was. She was trying to process an unaccustomed disregard. The waiter rolled around to check on the people next to us yet again and to deliver drinks and bread to other tables down the row. Trying to keep calm, she motioned for him to come over. "We haven't gotten our drinks yet," she said. "Can you bring us our drinks, please? And we'd like bread too," she added, looking over at the couple who had arrived after us. They were now dipping theirs in olive oil as we stared at an empty table. He nodded and said sure, but stopped to check on several other tables on his way back to the kitchen, which delayed him further. He reappeared later with dishes on his tray, but these were now the appetizers for the couple at the next table. The family friend motioned to him again. "Our drinks, and we never got the bread." "Oh, right, sure," he said, turning back again. It was now hard for her to concentrate on whatever it was she was saying. The people next to us were remarking on how good the appetizers were and had all but finished their bread. Their table was laden and ours was empty, and she seemed exquisitely aware of the couple beside us, that they were passing us on the escalator of dining attention. On one of his many rounds past our table, the waiter at last brought the drinks, but not the bread, and the exclusion was now impossible to ignore. Finally, he showed up with the entrees. The people next to us were on to their desserts, which were lovely, apparently, from what they were saying. She stared at the pasta and jostled it with her fork, tasted it, and set the fork down. "Pasta's cold. It's not even good. How's your fish?" "It's okay, not great. Mine's cold, too." "I'm getting the waiter." Her face was now approaching crimson. She fidgeted in her seat and looked around for him, shaking her head in disbelief. She was barely able to keep it together. "Can you come here a second?" she called out to him as he passed again. "I know exactly what this is about. This is about racism." Her voice was rising. She was loud enough for the whole restaurant to hear. "You're a racist. This restaurant is racist. We sat here all this time, and you served all these other people at all these other tables, and you ignored us this whole time just because she's African American." People at other tables were now looking over at me when I had not wanted this attention. I had no interest in making a federal case out of this. If I responded like that every time I was slighted, I'd be telling someone off almost every day. But she was just getting started. I want your name. I want the manager's name. I will turn this place out. She pushed the bowl of pasta to the center of the table. The pasta's cold, she said. I can't even eat it. Her fish is cold. She can't eat hers. I'm not paying. We're not paying. I'm telling everybody I know not to come here. This is crap. With all of the ruckus, the manager came out to see what was going on. As it happened, the manager was a petite African-American woman who seemed cowed by the ferocity of this newly minted anti-racist, anti-casteist, upper caste woman standing before her enraged at the unaccustomed humiliation. The manager apologized profusely, but my friend was having none of it. She stormed out of the restaurant, and I walked out with her. It took a while for her to calm down. Part of me wanted to say to her, imagine going through something like this almost every day, not knowing when or how it might happen. You wouldn't last very long. We can't afford to be blowing up every time we're slighted and ignored. We stand up when we need to, but we have to find a way not to go off every time and still get through the day. Part of me resented that she could go ballistic and get away with it when I might not even be believed. It was caste privilege to go off in the restaurant the way she did. It was a measure of how differently we are treated that she could live for over 40 years and not experience what is a daily possibility for any person born to the subordinate caste, that it was so alien to her, it so jangled her, that she blew up over it. But part of me wished that every person in the dominant caste who denies and deflects, minimizes and gaslights African Americans and other marginalized people could experience what she did. She had been radicalized in a matter of minutes. She knew full well that this was not how people treated her when she was out there with others in the dominant caste. She had come to the realization on her own. And part of me, the biggest part of me, was happy to see her righteous indignation on my behalf, on her own behalf, and on behalf of all the people who endure these indignities every day. It would be a better world if everyone could feel what she felt for once and awaken. I just have to tell you that I found this book on the new bookshelf in our own wonderful library at the Forest, an institution that sets a tone by having the library front and center as you walk in the building and look to the right and see all that wonderful space and people reading. And our wonderful librarian with her volunteers, she's a volunteer, who managed to fill our shelves, is to be congratulated. I loved this book so much that I went right out and bought it after I read it. And I recommend that everybody watching in TV land or here buy this book as well. Thank you very much.